All right. In this lecture, I'm going to go through Chapter 4, which covers a lot of information. I know that from past experience, this is a chapter that a lot of students find a little bit overwhelming just because we go through a lot of different parts of the brain and the nervous system in general. So what I'm going to do in my lecture is I'm just going to kind of go through the high points because I don't want to add too much additional information. I think your textbook does a really nice job of going through the different parts of the nervous system, the different branches, and they also do a really nice job of kind of mapping out the brain. So I'm not going to recreate what they already did because, again, I know that this chapter can already feel like a lot. So definitely read the chapter. I would recommend studying it, go through it a few different times, maybe make flashcards to try to learn the different parts of the brain, the different neurotransmitters, understand how a neuron works. All of those are extremely important, so I don't want you to think that they aren't important if I don't repeat them here. So I'm going to go through all the same sections as the chapter, but again, just try to maybe restate a few of the major points using different language, try to use a few different examples, but I'm not going to add too much additional information. So just to start, I want to kind of make sure we're all on the same page that a lot of the things that you probably think you know about the brain or research about the brain is probably not correct. So, some of you might think that you're a left brain thinker, right brain thinker. Some of you might, think that there are well-documented differences in brain functioning based on gender. We always hear this kind of myth floating around that we only use 10% of our brain. All of those things are false. And so I don't want you to start this chapter with any misconceptions or believing any of these myths. So just kind of approach this chapter from you're learning a new topic and you know nothing, because I do think a lot of the things that students understand or think they understand coming into general psych are actually false. I also get a lot of questions from students when they see what this chapter is about, in terms of why are we doing this in a psychology class? I didn't sign up for a biology class. I know some of you maybe want to be doctors or go into the medical field, but probably most of you don't. And so it might feel really weird to be talking about kind of the nitty-gritty components of the nervous system. Well, in actuality, there's an entire subfield of psychology called neuropsychology. Neuropsychologists study the brain. They study the nervous system as a whole, and they try to better understand what we would consider normal behavior. And I'm putting air quotes around normal because I don't really typically use that word or think it really means anything. But what they really mean is that neuropsychologists try to understand how people function typically. And then by understanding typical functioning, we can then understand the possibilities of what can go wrong with the system. And so neuropsychologists work in hospitals, they work at VAs, they conduct research on their own. And so they cover a lot of different responsibilities in the field of psychology. And so it is kind of this up and coming newer field, because I think we're starting to have a better appreciation for the role of neuropsychologists in helping us understand how the brain and the nervous system kind of generally can impact functioning. So let's just kind of start with the basics of what I mean when I say nervous system, because there are a lot of different components here, and we're going to kind of hone in on a few of these components in much more detail later on. Again, I really think your book does a good job. This is kind of a hard chapter for me to teach because it really is just kind of listing parts of the brain or kind of defining what these different branches of the nervous system do. It's kind of hard to make this fun and interesting because the way that neuropsychology is fun is kind of working one-on-one with individual patients. And the people I know that are neuropsychologists describe it as you're kind of like figuring out a puzzle. If you have a client in front of you that maybe has issues with speech and they're losing fine motor skills, it's up to you as the neuropsychologist to try to determine where in the nervous system the functioning is breaking down. And so working with the clients one-on-one, as a field, as a discipline, neuropsychology is fascinating. But to kind of just glance over this in a general psych field, in a general psychology class, I think it doesn't really give it its due in terms of how interesting and exciting it is. So just generally speaking, the nervous system just helps us process things. It helps us respond to stimuli. It is the coordinating system that helps all of our all of the information be interpreted, all of the information is being taken in, and then our body determines a way to respond. And so we're talking about, the kind of the most basic involuntary responses like sneezing. We're talking about more complex fine motor skills that maybe, some of the athletes in the class, can relate to. We're talking about breathing, we're talking about digestion, we're talking about higher order thinking, like solving problems or solving puzzles. And so really there's a lot going on here. So just to kind of, get us going, what we know is that the human nervous system has multiple divisions, right? And so typically any general psych book you're going to pick up, they're going to describe the nervous system using some type of a figure like this to show you the visuals of how these different components relate to each other. So the human nervous system can be divided into the central and the peripheral nervous systems. So the central nervous system is composed of the brain and the spinal cord. So you can think of the spinal cord as just an extension of the brain. It's going to bring information to the brain and then take information from the brain to other parts of the body. On the other hand, the peripheral nervous system is basically all the other nerves that are located outside of the spine and the brain. So that's going to cover a lot of different areas of the body. The peripheral nervous system is going to bring information into the central nervous system, right? Because often in life we get information from, touching things with our hands, and that information has to get up to our brain somehow. And so the peripheral nervous system will take a message to the spinal cord, which would then take the message up to the brain. And so these are going to be kind of integrated, complementary systems within our nervous system. So let's focus over here for a little bit on the peripheral. So the peripheral nervous system can be divided into the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. So the somatic is usually going to be things that are voluntary. So the skeletal muscular system in our body is what we're really talking about. It's how our body's interacting with external cues or the external environment. On the other hand, the autonomic is typically more things that are involuntary. So those are some of the things I mentioned just a few minutes ago, things like digestion, salivation, whether or not your eyes dilate. So these are kind of involuntary things, and it's more of the internal environment that we're focusing on with the autonomic nervous system. From the autonomic, we can then further divide it into the parasympathetic and the sympathetic. So those are two different branches of the autonomic system. So for now, let's just focus in a little bit more on the spinal cord. We're going to talk more about the brain in a few minutes, probably in part 2 of this video, because I have quite a bit to say till we get there. But again, please read your chapter, look at the different components of the brain. There's just so much there. And again, I don't want to bore you by just repeating definitions. I just don't think that, that would add to your learning experience. So for now, we're going to focus on the spinal cord, and then we're going to hone in more on the autonomic branches, and then we'll move on to talking more specific about neurons. So before we get too much further into other areas of the nervous system, I want to pause and make sure that we appreciate what spinal reflexes are and understand how they're different from other movements or kind of tendencies of our body. And so what you saw here, the example is someone touches something hot and their body kind of perceives or a signal is created and then sent within the nervous system. And so what's cool about spinal reflexes is that they're automatic. It requires absolutely no conscious effort. There's no thinking. It does not require the brain to get involved. So the brain's completely offline during this process. And so essentially what it is a nerve impulse that's going to send a message to the spinal cord, which then sends a command back to the muscle that essentially just moves the hand away. And so this is so important because think about if the brain had to get involved in this situation. It would take quite a bit of time for the nervous system or the nerves to send the message up to the brain for you to think about, this is kind of uncomfortable. I think it hurts. Maybe I should move my hand. Yep, I'm going to move my hand. And then you send a message down to the muscle to contract and move your hand away. So that would be a really kind of crappy process for this to follow because you would end up getting more hurt, more burned. I also want to note that the reflexes above the neck are actually kind of housed within the lower part of the brain, not the spinal cord. So something like sneezing or blinking is not going to be a spinal reflex. Again, that's going to be housed in the kind of lower portion of the brain. So as I said, we were going to also get a little bit more into the autonomic nervous system, which again can be broken into the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic. So you can see, I kind of have, it's broken down into the left side is the sympathetic or the arousing side. The right side here is the parasympathetic, which is calming, and it shows kind of the bodily functions. And then it kind of, shows you in the spinal cord where things are housed, and again, kind of just restates what the process is. And so you can see that each organ or gland has nerves that are both sympathetic and parasympathetic, because if you kind of scroll and just look, you see eyes, heart, stomach, it's kind of duplicated organs and glands because they have nerves that serve both functions, essentially. So the sympathetic nervous system is our fight, flight, freeze response, if you've ever heard of that. It's essentially the process that comes online when we perceive a threat or feel stressed or feel startled. It's going to stimulate and mobilize energy. You can think of it as psychological arousal. So if you were hiking in the woods and all of a sudden you heard a bear growl and you heard rustling in the bushes and you turned and you looked and you were facing a grizzly bear, chances are your sympathetic nervous system is going to kick in. Your eyes are going to dilate, your pupils will dilate to enhance your vision. Your heart's going to start pumping faster to drive blood to your muscles to kind of activate and engage the systems you might need to run or fight. Your stomach is going to stop digestion because it doesn't matter if you are digesting that burrito you just ate. It matters more if you get out alive. And so you can kind of look through the list here and see the different things that the body is doing to kind of engage or get itself ready to do something. And so we call it the fight, flight, freeze response because those are kind of the classic responses. So if you see that grizzly, you might try to fight it. You might just completely freeze, or you might kind of run away. And so as I think I mentioned early in the class, I'm a trauma psychologist, and so I do a lot of work with people that have been in combat or have faced kind of scary situations like mass shooters, have been physically assaulted. And so what we see is the sympathetic nervous system, it's kind of a unique response, meaning that each person's going to be different, and this is an unconscious thing, right? When you see the grizzly bear, you don't sit down and do a pros cons list for whether you should fight, flight, or freeze. You just kind of do something, and essentially your body just decides for you. And so it's kind of interesting to think about that, to really make sure someone's going to fight, flight, or freeze, you have to train them to do that. And so that's what a lot of people like in the military, that's why they go to basic training. It's to, kind of expose them to noises like gunshots, to make sure that they don't just kind of freeze or run away if they're in a combat zone. Other than people that are actually trained to respond a certain way, most of us just kind of end up doing just whatever the body decides. So it's kind of an interesting thing to think about, that your chances of survival could actually just be this kind of instinct that your body ends up deciding for you. The parasympathetic on the other side here is in charge of rest and kind of digestion. It's essentially conserving energy, and we can think of it as psychological relaxation. So these are two complementary systems. We need both sides, right? We need the sympathetic side to kind of engage and get us ready to go in a threatening, dangerous situation, but we need the parasympathetic to calm us down, because we all know what it feels like to be super anxious or super nervous for a long period of time. It doesn't feel good. Our body is not built to do that. And so that's why we talk about this kind of stuff in this class, is that a lot of the psychological disorders, I've treated in the past, anxiety, for example, it's essentially the sympathetic nervous system misfiring. So if you have anxiety or know someone with an anxiety disorder, think about what that looks like and feels like for them. It's essentially that system continuing to fire despite the fact that there's no threat present. And so all of these systems are integrated, and all of these matter in terms of our functioning. And so that's why we talk about brain functioning in the nervous system in a general psychology class. So kind of a hint for your activity, I might be referring to something on this slide when I ask you about thinking about the impact of the global pandemic.